breakout session. My name is Kendra Mellish, and I am your moderator for this session. And my colleague Shannon Snow is also here. And we will be your supports if you need anything on the tech side of things, and also helping Daniel to moderate some questions today. So Daniel is open to questions throughout his presentation, so you are welcome to be putting those in the chat during his discussion, and I'll be reading them out. Or if you'd prefer to ask questions yourself, you can always use the raise hand button, and we'll call on you to unmute yourself and you can ask those questions themselves. So just to get us started, with no further ado, I'll provide an introduction to our speaker today. So Daniel Ohaegbu is a leader in EDI transformations with experience developing EDI within academia, industry, and community organizations. Daniel is the founder and executive director of the Atlantic Student Development Alliance here in PEI. The Atlantic Business Magazine 2020 selected Daniel Ohaegbu Bridge Builder as one of the 30 under 30 innovators in Atlantic Canada. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us today. And over to you.
Thank you, Kendra. Can everyone hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
See. Yes, thank you again, Kendra. I would like to thank the Career Development Association. I would like to thank Shannon and Kendra for their support today. And I would also like to thank Jenna. And yes, like Kendra said, my name is Ikechukwu Daniel Ohaegbu, and I'm originally from Nigeria, West Africa, and I came to PEI in 2014 to study at the university, and then I graduated in 2017, and thereafter, I guess the rest is history, as they say. You come to PEI, and somehow, some way, you just never really want to leave PEI anymore. So, yeah, when I guess to start my keynote for today. I just initially, when Ethan reached out to me and the Career Development Association reached out to me to present on equity and diversity, it is such a broad and complex topic that it is difficult to encapsulate in 30 minutes, or very difficult to encapsulate in an hour, dare to say. And when we look at like equity and diversity, and when we look at like the driving factor, which is systems of oppression, which is racism, which has and is a 500-year plus problem, you can tell how difficult it is to encapsulate all of that into 30 minutes. Please, if you hear any notifications, please ignore that. That's just my email popping probably. But with the theme for this year, it was around career rejuvenation. And again, I had to go back and try to understand what career rejuvenation means in our today's climate, in our today's society. And the word rejuvenation meaning, like kickstarting or starting over or rebuilding or reviving, or there's so many synonyms to what rejuvenation means. And I kept hitting roadblocks because I was like, how do I present equity, diversity, inclusion, and how do I present that in a format that also aligns with where we should be going, that also acknowledges, the past, that acknowledges our present and acknowledges our future. So therefore, I reached out to my mentor. I know she's here, Amanda Fernandez. She is the CEO founder of Inclusify, and we started talking, and with her help and mentorship, I was able to come up with this presentation. Thank you, Amanda. So something that kept coming back to mind again was, where do we go from here? When we look at our past, when we look at our present, when we look at our history as a people, we should always ask ourselves, where do we go from here? So with that said, again, my name is Ikechukwu Daniel Ohaegbu, and I am the Executive Director and founder of the Atlantic Student Development Alliance. And next slide, please. So I would like to start this keynote with acknowledging and respecting that the land on which we are gathered today is the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We respect the history, we respect the spirituality, we respect the culture of the Mi'kmaq people who have lived here for over 15,000 years, and that of other indigenous people who have migrated here from all across Turtle Island. So in our efforts to push this needle further, in our efforts to acknowledge our history, in our efforts to acknowledge our present, and in our efforts to right the wrongs, to pay our respects to the indigenous, to the rightful owners of this land, it is always good to kick off every event, or in this case, every keynote, by this acknowledgement. Next slide, please. And our outline for today, to start with, we will be going through an exercise. And after that, we will be basically diving into certain definitions. And these definitions are with respect to diversity, inclusion, integration, and assimilation. Also, we'll be looking at how integration and assimilation manifest in organizations. And then again, we'll be asking ourselves the question, where do we go from here? Next slide, please. And to start the keynote, I would like you to pick one of these two statements. So this is our exercise right now. And please, if you have a pen and a paper in front of you, or if you're using an iPad or laptops or any device, or if you have a pen and paper, please, I would like you to pick one of these two statements. And I would like you to think of which statement you think should be the foundation of tackling racism and oppression. And what I mean by this is written and unwritten laws. Think about the policies, think about rules, procedures, processes, regulations, and guidelines that govern you and your profession. It could also be the things that govern you and your organization. And after you have decided on which one of these statements, I would like you to reflect on your choice of statement and articulate why you picked that statement. And I'll read statement one for you. So statement one says, our efforts should be geared towards developing and civilizing racial groups. Statement two says, I hope that was that me? No? Okay. So it says, our efforts should be geared towards placing white and BIPOC, which means Black, Indigenous, and people of color, in the same spaces, because on the one hand, we will develop and reduce the differences between Black, Indigenous, people of color, and white people. And on the other hand, it will remove racism in white people. Please keep your notes. We will come back to this exercise in a little bit after we have built our foundation. So I'll give us a minute to please go over the statements again and pick one. Okay, next slide, please. So let's start by defining diversity. Diversity in organizations is about numbers and representation. Sometimes in my line of work, I hear people, employers, and I hear organizations say, oh, I want a diverse candidate. A candidate cannot be diverse. One person cannot be diverse. As much as I am a Black man sharing this presentation with you today, I am not the spokesperson of all Black people in Canada. I'm not the spokesperson of all Black people in PEI. I am not the spokesperson of all Black people in Nigeria. I am just Daniel Ikechukwu Ohaegbu. I'm the spokesperson for myself, and I am one individual. I cannot be diverse, and as one individual, I cannot bring diversity into your organization. Diversity has been defined as something to comply with or something that is right to do. An ethical imperative, it is also a business priority that provides organizations with a competitive advantage. what we should keep in mind is that there is value in all of these definitions. Next slide, please. So inclusion is about impact. Inclusion must be cultivated within an individual, within an organization. When I look at like diversity and inclusion, I look at it from a personal, interpersonal, and systemic lens. But for this presentation, I would like us to as the uniqueness of individual, the uniqueness of every individual, and how that uniqueness is celebrated. The focus of inclusion is not so much on demographic groups, but on emphasis on knowledge. The focus of inclusion is on emphasis on skills and on emphasis of experiences each person can offer and each person can bring to the table. The experience of inclusion indicates that employees' values and thoughts are not only accepted, but integrated by the organization. Again, when we talk about inclusion, there is this very popular saying and concept that I so much dislike. I believe it's inclusion is being okay. Sorry about that. Yeah. So I was talking about inclusion. So inclusion is the uniqueness of individual and how that uniqueness is celebrated. And when we look at inclusion, the focus is not so much on the demographic group, but it is emphasis on knowledge, it is emphasis on skills, it is emphasis on experience that each person can offer. The experiences of inclusion indicates that employees' values and thoughts are not only accepted, but integrated by the organization. Inclusion is not about asking people to come to your table, and we will get to that. We'll get back to that analogy in a few minutes. So I hear people, when people talk about inclusion in our society today, they talk about inclusion as being asked to the table. But again, we should ask ourselves, what table? And diversity for me at this point is so saturated that I almost dislike the word diversity, because there is so much complexity and so much violence that the word in itself attributes. And we'll come to that in a later point. Next slide, please. Boom. So now that we have built our foundations on diversity and inclusion, let's define integration and assimilation. If you pick statement 1, policies and programs should be geared towards developing and civilizing racial groups. This is assimilation. So if you pick statement 1 that says our efforts should be geared towards developing and civilizing racial groups, basically that is assimilation. And we should look at like what we are looking to develop and adopt that would lead us to this assimilation. So assimilationists take the form of saviors. As the missionaries, you are the melting pot, you are the melting potter, you are teachers, you are nuns and priests in residential school, you are John A. MacDonald, who stated the purpose of residential schools, and I quote, "Kill the Indian in the child." As assimilationist, you're Pierre Trudeau in 1969, who unveiled a policy paper that proposed ending the special legal relationship between Aboriginal peoples and the Canadian states and dismantling the Indian Act. When it was vehemently rejected, my dear Papa Trudeau said, and I quote, "We'll keep them in the ghetto as long as they want." With assimilationist ideologies, you believe that Black, Indigenous, and people of color can be saved. You believe that they're capable of development, that someone like me can become fully human. You believe that if I just studied hard enough, if I worked hard enough and left my blackness or brownness behind in my growth and development towards being as white as possible, you believe that with assimilation, we focus on behavior modification of people who are not white. So hence creating the standard. And again, this is where we go into racism and the power construct and behind racism, that one race is superior over the other. With assimilation, the onus is placed on individuals from underserved communities to change, when what needs changing are systems, structures, and policies that privilege a few and cause disadvantage for the rest. So when we look at assimilationists, we look at how assimilationists reduce Black, Indigenous, and people of color to the level of children. And I quote, "If only someone like me would just learn how to act and behave, then my problems as a man of color or a woman of color or a person of color would end." Assimilationists believe that white people are culturally and behaviorally superior, and following that, policies and programs are developed and geared towards civilizing racial groups. The operating word for assimilationists are civilize. They use words such as to uplift, to save. And that's where in my line of work, we refer to them as the white saviors. So moving on, now that we have an understanding of assimilation, let us dive into integration. So if you pick statement 2, you will adopt the ideologies of an integrationist. And so you may ask, what does this mean? It means that the policies and programs, the human capital practices will be geared towards placing white and Black, Indigenous people of color in white spaces. There are very few spaces in the US and in Canada that are not white spaces. And to be clear, white spaces are toxic to Black, Indigenous people of color. With integration, our starting point is assimilation. And what this means is that we start genocidal assimilationist policies and practices. And when we recognize that our practices and policies are harmful, assimilation shifts into integration. So the way I like to put this in context is we look at assimilation, and that's where when we look at like Canada as a society and Canada as a nation, we talk about we talk about multiculturalism and how diverse it is, but we should also look back at our history as to how first assimilation has led us to genocide of the indigenous people. We know what happened, we know what transpired a few weeks ago. And with that too, in our recent times, we see that this assimilation that has happened in the past has shapeshifted into integration, and how we integrate our international students and our immigrants or refugees into this Canadian culture. So I would like to highlight that racism is not static. It is an iterative process, and it is insidious in how it morphs. Integration is an example of the insidious evolution of racism. So here you start with assimilationist ideas, and in addition to cultural genocide inherent in assimilationist ideas, you end up with asking Black, Indigenous, and people of color to work. You end up asking them to play. You end up asking them to study. You end up asking them to live in spaces that were not designed for us, basically, and in spaces that were not built for us to thrive. So when we hold the values based on integration, we expect Black, Indigenous, and people of color to integrate into whiteness and into white spaces. And this is seen as racial progress. In the integrationist strategy, you recognize that racism exists, and your only solution is to place Black, Indigenous, and people of color in close proximity to racism. if you are of the opinion that Black indigenous of people should, I quote, get over it, or if you find yourself thinking it's not a big deal, or I think the more prevalent one I hear commonly is racism does not exist in Canada, and in PEI it's only in the South. I remember when the president of the United States, Donald Trump, was when the former president Donald Trump was still the president. A lot of it's a lot of the conversation was around how, for the lack of a better word, how shitty he was, how racist it is, and all of that stuff. But we tend to point fingers at our neighbors in the South, but our other three fingers are pointing back at us. And if you're of the opinion that we should get over it, or if you're thinking that it's not a big deal, or if you're thinking that racism does not exist in Canada, I want you to know this. As people who are not white, we are constantly on the receiving end of numerous tiny incidents like this. What may seem tiny to you is not tiny to us. If the dismissal of our very own experiences and the encounter of everyday racism happened to us once in a while, we could easily dismiss it. But this kind of hate happens to us on a daily basis. This everyday hate happens to us in the grocery store. It happens to us in the workplace. It happens to us in libraries. It happens to us at the Santa Claus parade in Christmas. It happens to us in the community centers. It happens to us at the public pool. It happens to us at the soccer field. I've been spat on before by white opponents. I've been told that they would buy me and my family. I've had to whiten my name on a resume just to get called for an interview. And more often than not, it is just a look. Sometimes it is tightening your grip on your purse. Sometimes it is a quick pat to ensure that your wallet is still there. Sometimes it is asking me how I learned how to speak the English language. This kind of hate is commonly termed microaggression, and that's another word that I dislike, but that's for another day. We term them microaggression because they are so tiny. But when we look at it on a broader context, is it really all that micro? When it happens at the frequency it does, because at the frequency and scale it happens, it is no longer micro, it is abusive. Again, next slide, please. So when we look at assimilation, we look at the racial standard of looking at oneself through the eyes of another racial group. And in this case, I quote, it is a dominant racial group. So we look at assimilationist ideas that are racist ideas focused on behavior modification. So we look at the indigenous communities, for example, and how this form of process was used to commit so much genocide and violence within this nation. When we look at assimilation, we focus on civilization. Next slide, please. When we look at integration, on the other hand, we look at how white spaces come to be defined as the ideal. And again, this is a construct, it's a power construct. We look at how non-white bodies are assimilated. We look at how whiteness becomes the racial progress. Next slide, please. So now that we have discussed assimilation and integration, for the second part of our keynote, let us look at how assimilation and integration manifest in organizations. I'm going to share examples based on my experiences as an immigrant. I'm going to share examples based on my experiences as a Black man, and also my experiences with my work with the Atlantic Student Development Alliance. So for those of you who do not know, ASDA, or the Atlantic Student Development Alliance, was founded as a result of my thesis research examining how Black African men and international students thrive in Canadian post-secondary institutions despite racism. So moving forward, a common solution to the problem of why there aren't Black, Indigenous, and people of color at the top of organizations and leadership is because of the lack of mentorship. Another manifestation of assimilation is mentorship. Let's start with what mentorship is not. Mentorship is not apprenticeship. It's not training required to do one's job. Mentorship focuses on behavior substitutions. And in predominantly white-led organizations, in settler colonial states like Canada and the US, mentorship marries the racist ideologies of assimilation and integration. We use the idioms playing the game or showing someone the ropes, but what are we really attempting to convey? When we look at mentorship, we look at it as the game is upholding white supremacy and the ropes shape-shift into nooses. You may feel as though the system rewarded you for your hard work, when in reality you served the system and you allowed it to thrive and were rewarded for good behavior. The goal of equity work is not to make those of us who are different similar or acceptable within an oppressive structure. There is difference between doing something to feel better and doing better. Doing better involves pushing back against the system that created the oppression instead of teaching those who are different to fit in. Last year, for example, the Deputy Minister made commitments on diversity and inclusion, and a Treasury Board directive on employment equity, diversity and inclusion was issued. So included in the Deputy Minister's commitment to diversity and inclusion were these statements: supporting language training for career development of Black employees and other racialized employees, Indigenous employees, and employees with disabilities, followed by implementing a mentoring program for Black employees and other racialized employees, Indigenous employees, and employees with disabilities within the organization, required that all deputy ministers and assistant deputy ministers shadow mentees that belong to one of the aforementioned equity deserving groups. So when I hear things like language training for Black and other racialized employees, when we hear things like mentoring programs for Black employees and other racialized groups, I want you to stop and ask yourself the following two questions. Question one, where and who is the onus for change being placed? Question two, how does this initiative address inequity at the systemic root level? And when you begin to engage with those questions, once you have answered these questions, I want you to consider how providing language training to members of undeserved communities is an assimilationist strategy that does not address whiteness and white monopolization of power, and is an attempt to keep things the same by requiring those who have been historically kept out to make the change so that we can fit in. So again, going back to inclusion, realizing that inclusion is not about the golden rule, which is treat others the way you want to be treated. Inclusion is about treating others as they want to be treated. So again, it's not about you, it's about how they want to be treated. So now let's look at what integration looks like in organizations. I had previously used the analogy of sitting at the table. Another analogy that comes up often is sharing the blankets. I don't know if most of us are familiar with this analogy. Let's say that the blanket actually belongs to us and we are happy to share it. We would be misguided in believing that most Black and Indigenous people want to share the blanket. Moreover, we are on stolen land and our natural resources this rich country is built upon stolen resources. I don't want to share the blanket. We talk about having a seat at the table, another similar analogy like the blanket. When we think about oppression in terms of structures and systems, the table and the blanket are still in your house. So now the structure and systems built on the foundation of whiteness, keep in mind that this is your house, this is your blanket, this is your table. So now let's look at another way to view this. Another way to view this would be, we are not asking to live in your house. We're not asking to sit at your table. We're not asking to take food away from your little ones. We're not asking you to share your blanket. We're not looking for handouts. What we are asking for, and the fact that we even have to ask, is dehumanizing. We want the opportunity to make our own homes. We want the opportunity to own dining tables with our own food, which we have worked for. We want to make our own blankets. Please consider what a privilege it is to have the decision-making authority to invite people to share your blankets and your tables, especially when these blankets and tables come from stolen land and enslaved labor. So there's a difference between feeling better and doing better. I know when we engage on diversity and equity work, there's always the fragility and guilt, and we can talk about the racial climate here in PEI, and I know like last year there was this huge march, and after that, like a lot of organizations released statements, a lot of leaders released statements, there was so much support and all of that. But when we look at it a year later, what has changed? So it seems that like we're doing things to feel better, but not actually doing things to do better. So now we have to look at, how are you satisfying your feelings instead of doing better? The solutions, outcomes, and interventions are dependent on how people are praised and then treated. When we look at integrating international students into the academia, or immigrants and refugees into the workforce and community, we should ask ourselves, what culture are they being forced into? When international students have to whiten their names on their resume just to get an interview opportunity, and only for the interviewer to be surprised that they are a Black, Indigenous, or person of color, we should ask ourselves, what culture are we integrating them into? When we ask immigrants and students and refugees that they should dress a certain way and act professional, we should ask ourselves, whose definition of professional are we referring to? And is this definition based on white niceness and Eurocentric fashion? What is considered professional is defined by white beauty standards. The natural hair of Black people is seen as unprofessional, while white beauty standards are seen as professional. Next slide, please. So again, coming back to the question, where do we go from here? And when I was called upon to share this presentation with you all, I kept asking myself, and the thing that kept popping into my mind was integration and assimilation. Because when we look at our systems and we look at our society today, all our structures are built on those two foundations. And not just those two foundations, because there are other underlying foundations, and there are other intersecting structures that we also have to look into. With this keynote, we have just started to scratch the surface of racial literacy. So where do we start? Some things I would like us to consider as a starting point is an effective diversity, equity, and inclusion work starts at the top of the organization with senior level management and the board, and ensuring alignment in values and understanding. And not just stopping there, there must be a follow-up. There must be a follow-up by ensuring that the policies, that there is actual impact through policies and execution plans. So what I mean by this is, oftentimes in this line of work, the boards or the leadership positions, they often send their staff members within the lower tiers of organizations to participate in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. There is a mismatch when your diversity is not the diversity within your organization or within your community or within institutions are not reflected both in the lower levels and in the upper levels. So as much as we can facilitate 100 workshops a year or 1,000 workshops a year, again, if there is no execution plan, and if these plans are not measurable, there will be no accountability. Nobody will be held accountable. Again, if you pay me, I will take your money and I will deliver the service to you. But again, it's not about the intention at this point. It is not about intention. The intention is not enough. We need to create action and measurable execution plans to drive diversity, equity, and inclusion in our leadership positions. These communities, these institutions, these organizations there needs to be a reflection of diversity, equity, and inclusion in all tiers. Again, number 2 would be ensuring that with every opportunity, systemic barriers are examined. We can't be looking at things through one lens. And one of my favorite authors, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, she talks about the danger of a single story. We have to look at things from multiple lenses. If we are to praise this diversity and multiculturalism that we so praise in our society today in Canada, we have to then integrate that into how we examine. We have to integrate those diverse and that diversity, and we have to reflect it in how we examine our systemic barriers. Because a lot of times, the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color are often dismissed. So again, where can we go from here? It's about holding people accountable for doing their part. So every one of us in this room today, all 40 of us, have a role to play. And we have to hold each other accountable for playing and doing our part. It's about tracking data and having metrics. Something that I realized while I was doing my thesis is that there is zero, and when I say zero, there is no data and metrics on Black, Indigenous, and people of color. There is no data and metrics on racialized groups. There is no data and metrics on any of this. We always reference Ontario, we reference Toronto. Yes, but we have to understand that the things happening in Toronto in context is so different from the things happening in PEI. We have to start tracking our data. We have to start having metrics. We have to start, and that is in itself too a form of accountability for us. Again, it's about developing an understanding of the current state of the organization. It's about developing and understand the current state of your institution, the current state of your organization or your department, so that we can plan next steps. It's about assessing where we are. We can't plan for where we are going if we do not know where we are. It's about formulating a plan and then acting on the plan. It's not enough to formulate the plan, we have to also act on it. So I believe for next steps, we should start by assessing where we are as individuals. We should start by assessing where our organizations stand on our equity, diversity, and inclusion journey. So again, ask yourself this question. As a career development professional working in a specific institution or in a specific organization, where do you stand and where does your organization stand in diversity, equity, and inclusion? So as you career development professionals think about career rejuvenation as a profession, where you bring people of color into your predominant white spaces and decide to develop a person of color, stop and think if you are expecting them to assimilate and integrate into white spaces. Next slide, please. So hence, I would like to leave us with a call to action. As career development professionals, we should ask ourselves these two questions. In fact, every day you wake up as an individual, you should ask yourself these two questions. What are you going to start working on to ensure that you are leaving your profession in a better space, in a better place than you found it? And how are you ensuring that we don't have another 500 years of oppression? Thank you very much for sharing your hearts and your ears with me. My name is Ikechukwu Daniel Ohaegbu, and I'm open to any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Hi, Daniel. So we do have a question for you. So I'll ask it on your behalf, Kai, but if you would prefer, you can raise your hand and let me know if you'd like to ask it directly. So I'll just give you a moment to indicate if you'd like to do that. No? Okay, so I'll ask. So Daniel, the question is, how would we assess where we are and where our organizations are in terms of diversity? What sorts of questions could we ask?
So that is something like that a diversity, inclusion, and equity officer or trainer would be able to do. So for me personally, we take either a quantitative or qualitative approach when we are assessing DEI in organizations. And so there is an assessment that would happen after our initial conversation. And then based on the climate and data that you present to us within your organization, we'll be able to provide you with the necessary tools and resources that you need.
Thank you for that answer. So a second question that's come in is, how could we look at language training through a BIPOC lens?
That's a very good question, Stacey. And with language, when we look at language, we look at I look at language through discourse analysis. And we look at language through as and when I and the current language that we use is basically through power, saying that like that whiteness is superior and the other is inferior. And with your question as to how we can look at language training through a BIPOC lens, I think there are several ways that we can definitely engage in that scope. Again, we should look at the current languages that are being used in the organization. I don't think there is there is no one way specifically to look at like language through a BIPOC lens. It has to, looking at language through a BIPOC lens within your institution or organization has to, first of all, you have to examine your values, you have to examine your mission, you have to examine your vision. And these are all processes that we can definitely like engage in. And also we have to look at like the demographic and climate within your institution and organization. There are tools that we can use to do this. So definitely like we can catch up after this presentation. I'll put up my email here as well so we can after this presentation and chat more.
Any other questions for Daniel?
I have a question, if I can jump in.
Please.
I wonder, Daniel, if you have any advice for folks who maybe aren't seeing that sort of buy-in at the upper level, but are looking to maybe make change from whatever position they're sort of at.
Do you mean like individuals who are not necessarily looking to diversify their leadership positions?
I'm thinking about people where maybe there isn't a lot of EDI buy-in sort of from leadership, but maybe they're working within a context where there's not a lot of EDI buy-in institutionally, but maybe there's individuals within organizations that are looking to sort of support BIPOC communities.
So yeah, with those kind of organizations, like when I look at those, it's very problematic and it's very challenging for individuals who are not looking into EDI. But I look at organizations who are successful. The most successful organizations are organizations that are diverse and that are inclusive and also are equitable in their leadership positions. And also overall, if we look at those organizations, like I'm trying to figure out like one that comes to mind off the bat of my head, but it's very problematic when organizations don't buy into equity. And buying into equity, diversity, and inclusion is not necessarily even should be a thing. I think more so we should focus on creating anti-racist spaces and being more anti-racist and removing or abolishing the ideologies of these power constructs that we have created in our societies today. And oftentimes the question I've currently, I guess, perceive in my field is, we don't know where these Black, Indigenous, and people of color are. They don't have the skills, they don't have the academics or the education or whatever. But again, we have created white standards, right? So it's going to be very difficult to solve a problem that you don't see as an individual or as an organization.
That makes sense. Thanks.
So I'll put one more call out for questions, either through the chat or if anyone would like to ask them directly of Daniel. So seeing none come in, if I can take this opportunity on behalf of those who are in the room today, as well as the wider planning committee, to thank you, Daniel, to thank you so much for your time today, for your sharing of your experiences. Thank you for your work, and very much thank you for this call to action at the end of the session today. We very much appreciate your time, of your framing, of your reframing, and for sharing those experiences that certainly sound like they are a heavy experience. So thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, I look forward to connecting and reconnecting. So please reach out whenever, however, and we'll chat more.